So autonomous solar cargo, we're already building this. The problem is, all right, so I'm going to walk through this way I'd explain it to someone in person because I think that's the easiest way to understand what's actually happening here. If you look at shipping today, it's obviously effective at moving huge amounts of cargo, but it's built around a pretty narrow model. Large ships move between large ports, everything runs on heavy fuel oil, and the routes are fairly rigid. It works well when everything is flowing smoothly, but it doesn't adapt very well. It's not really designed for anything outside of that structure. Smaller destinations, islands, inland routes, those can get treated as secondary problems and have to plug into the main system somehow. And the energy side of it is just as limiting when you have your entire system depending on fuel that has to be extracted, transported, and burned. Your hands are always tied to the cost of that structure. So it doesn't matter how efficient the ship is, you're still operating inside that constraint. So the issue isn't that shipping doesn't work, it's that it's locked into one way of working. And that way doesn't leave much room for flexibility or change. So I'll talk about the history. What's interesting is that if you go back far enough, shipping wasn't built like this at all. It was naturally distributed. It followed wind currents and conditions. There wasn't this heavy dependence on centralized infrastructure. Even some of the earliest logistics systems weren't even ships in the modern sense. Their economies were built around passive or semi-passive transport using natural forces like simple floating raft structures that would just carry goods downstream. There would be unmanned log rafts used in rivers in Asia and Europe, and current-driven drift systems where cargo would literally be released upstream and recovered downstream. Even in open water, people use tidal flows and predictable current cycles as a form of scheduled transportation, effectively letting the ocean move goods for them with minimal intervention. Then the engines came in, after the wind, of course, sailing. Fuel took over, and eventually containerization scaled everything massively, especially after people like Malcolm McLean pushed that model forward. So that's what gave us the modern system: fast, standardized, and incredibly efficient at scale. But it also narrowed the way we think about moving goods. Everything became about bigger ships, bigger ports, and fixed routes. Now we're in a position where we can open that back up again, but using modern technology instead of going backwards. What already works, the important thing here is that none of this is hypothetical anymore. You've already got sailing cargo ships moving real products across oceans like coffee, cocoa, rum, even people. That's happening right now. You've got projects like the Energy Observer showing that a vessel can operate globally using solar, wind, hydrogen without fossil fuels and stopping to refuel. On the solar side, companies like Sunreef Yachts are already building boats, yachts, where solar isn't added on. It's built into the surface itself. The hull, the structures, everything's designed to generate power. And then there's the question of heavy cargo, which always comes up, but ships like Blue Marlin move entire oil rigs, and vessels like the MS Helios handle massive steel loads all the time. So weight isn't really the limiting factor people think it is. Electric propulsion actually helps here. If you've ever been in something like a Tesla Model S, the torque is immediate. That translates differently into moving heavy loads at low speeds, which is most of the way shipping works anyways. So all the pieces already exist, they're just not connected yet. The roadmap for the autonomous waypoint network, this is where the autonomous part actually matters, because it's not just about removing crew or people, it's about changing how the vessels actually move. Instead of the fixed routes between major ports, you start thinking in terms of waypoint missions. The vessel doesn't just go from one place to another. It follows a sequence of waypoints that can shift depending on wind, currents, energy availability, and delivery needs. Basically whatever is shipping, but that becomes especially useful for islands and coastal regions. You don't need massive port infrastructure if you can run smaller autonomous or semi-autonomous vessels that move between points, dropping off and picking up cargo as they go. So instead of one big delivery, you get continuous movement through a network. Ocean-going sailing vessels, they can handle long-distance transport. Then smaller electric vessels and solar barges take over for regional and inland distribution. Because the system is autonomous, you can scale the number of routes and deliveries without scaling complexity in the same way. It becomes flexible instead of rigid as it is now. The energy system would be built into the route. Once you start thinking in terms of a network, energy has to change too. So instead of vessels carrying all their energy from start to finish, you could distribute the energy across the routes themselves, or, produce the energy along the route. Out in the ocean, there are companies like Core Power Ocean, and they're building systems that generate power from wave motion. The ocean is constantly moving, so you can capture that energy and make it available along shipping paths. These things look like giant buoys. So you would just basically attach your barge that is ocean going to the buoy, anchor, charge up, and go. These could be placed along routes that are common. On rivers, the pumped hydro can be placed along the routes to store and release energy when it's needed. And that would turn the inland waterways into part of the energy infrastructure. And then there's a really simple piece that ends up being surprisingly powerful when the inland vessels are moored, which they moor for a long time. If they're getting loaded or unloaded or at night, they can just use the current to spin the propeller and generate electricity. They could have several propellers, under the vessel as well. So instead of sitting there draining power, they're actually charging themselves using the river. Solar layers on top of this, panels on vessels, barges, infrastructure, even directly on container stacks to retrofit existing ships. You add in the fixed sails, rotor sails, kite system, and even traditional vessels start shifting towards this model. Almost everything could be retrofitted to be much more efficient than it currently is. So when you step back, the system looks completely different from what we have today, but a sailing cargo vessel leaves the Caribbean with coffee, right? Crosses the Atlantic using wind, then transfers the cargo into a distributed network. From there, the solar barges and smaller electric vehicles move it inland or along the coast, following waypoint-based routes and pulling energy from the environment as they go. At that point, energy isn't something the vessel carries the whole way, it's something the system provides. So, in closing, that really is the shift It's not one new type of ship or one breakthrough technology. It's taking propulsion, energy, and routing and designing them as one system instead of separate problems. From where I'm sitting, this doesn't feel far off. It feels like something that's already started and just hasn't been tied together yet. And that's what we're doing now.